The dust still settles on the old stagecoach road that winds through Devil's Canyon, 15 miles north of what used to be Silverbrook Station. Local historians claim the abandoned inn was just another casualty of the railroad's westward expansion. But the few travelers who passed through in its final years described something else entirely, something about the way the widows smiled when new guests arrived, and how those smiles never quite reached their eyes. Between 1871 and 1879, the widows Inn housed hundreds of travelers making the treacherous journey through the Colorado Rockies. By the end, 7 different widows had operated the establishment, each inheriting it under circumstances that seemed tragic yet convenient. What those records don't mention is why the inn's guest registry contained 347 names of people who signed in, but only 89 who were ever confirmed to have signed out. Before we dive into the dark secrets of the Widows Inn and uncover the truth about what happened to those missing travelers, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling tales from America's forgotten highways. Let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. These stories happened everywhere, and they're closer to home than you might think. The truth about the Widows Inn would remain buried until a highway crew in 1924 unearthed something that made even experienced workers refuse to continue their excavation. What they found beneath the inn's foundation changed how we understand the darkness that can flourish in the most trusted places. Devil's Canyon wasn't the most dangerous route through the Colorado Territory, but it was the most isolated. The narrow pass carved a precarious path between towering granite walls, with Silverbrook Creek rushing alongside the trail, its waters turned silver by mineral deposits that glinted like scattered coins in the afternoon sun. During the 1870s, this route served as a vital connection between the mining towns of the eastern Rockies and the rail terminals that could carry ore to eastern markets. The journey through Devil's Canyon required careful timing. Travelers needed to cover the 47-mile stretch in daylight, as the trail became treacherous after dark. Spring snowmelt could turn the creek into a raging torrent that washed out bridges, while winter storms could trap travelers for days in drifts that reached above a man's head. Most concerning were the steep drop-offs where a single misstep could send horse, rider, and cargo tumbling into the canyon below. It was into this challenging landscape that the Widows Inn was established in 1871, positioned at the exact midpoint of the Devil's Canyon route. The location was strategically perfect. Travelers starting early from either direction would reach the inn just as their horses needed rest and they required food and shelter for the night. The building itself was substantial, a 2-story log structure with thick walls designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters and a large stable that could accommodate up to 20 horses. The inn was the vision of Margaret Henley, a widow from Kansas who arrived in Colorado Territory with her 2 teenage daughters and enough capital to purchase the land and construct the building. Margaret had lost her husband in a farming accident, she explained to anyone who asked, and the insurance settlement had provided the means for a fresh start in the West. She chose the Devil's Canyon location after careful research, recognizing that the steady stream of traffic would provide reliable income while the isolation would offer the peace and safety she sought for her daughters. Margaret's background seemed perfectly suited for innkeeping. She had managed a large household in Kansas, cooking for farm workers during harvest season and handling the complex logistics of feeding and housing temporary laborers. Her daughters, Sarah and Emma, were experienced in housekeeping and customer service, having helped their mother manage the family's hospitality obligations since childhood. The family presented themselves as hardworking, respectable, and grateful for the opportunity to serve the traveling public. The construction of the Widows Inn was completed in the spring of 1871, and Margaret immediately began advertising its services in newspapers throughout the territory. Her advertisements emphasized the inn's unique location, reasonable rates, and the special attention that women proprietors brought to ensuring guest comfort and safety. She particularly stressed the quality of the meals, promising fresh bread, hearty stews, and coffee that would restore travelers for the remainder of their journey. The inn's first guests were miners heading east with gold from the Leadville district. They arrived dusty and exhausted from the difficult trail, grateful for the hot food and clean beds that Margaret provided. Their testimonials about the inn's hospitality spread quickly through the territory's informal communication networks, and within weeks, the Widows Inn had established a reputation as an essential stop for anyone traveling the Devil's Canyon route. The layout of the inn was designed for maximum efficiency and guest comfort. The ground floor featured a large common room with a massive stone fireplace, long tables for communal dining, and a bar area where travelers could purchase liquor and tobacco. The kitchen occupied the rear of the building, equipped with a large iron stove and ample storage for provisions. Upstairs, 12 rooms provided sleeping accommodations, each furnished with sturdy beds, wash basins, and hooks for hanging clothes and equipment. Margaret's pricing structure was competitive but profitable. A night's lodging cost 50 cents, meals were 25 cents each, and care for horses was 15 cents per animal. These rates were standard for frontier hospitality establishments, but the quality of service at the Widow's Inn exceeded what travelers typically encountered. Margaret's meals were generous and well-prepared, the beds were clean and comfortable, and the stable was well-maintained with quality hay and grain available for the animals. The seasonal rhythm of travel through Devil's Canyon created predictable patterns of business for the inn. Spring brought miners and merchants eager to resume operations after winter delays. Summer was the busiest season, with steady traffic from dawn to dusk as travelers took advantage of favorable weather conditions. Fall brought a final surge of activity as people hurried to complete their business before winter made the route impassable. Winter was quiet but not entirely inactive, as emergency travelers and mail carriers occasionally braved the dangerous conditions. Margaret adapted her operations to these seasonal variations, hiring additional help during busy periods and using quiet times for maintenance and preparation. She maintained detailed records of guest arrivals and departures, noting names, destinations, and any special requirements or circumstances. These records served both business and safety purposes, allowing her to track her income while also providing information that could be valuable if travelers encountered difficulties along the route. The community that developed around the Widow's Inn was small but essential. A blacksmith named Jonas Pittman established a forge nearby, providing repair services for damaged equipment and shoes for horses that had suffered injuries on the rocky trail. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a physician from Denver, made regular visits to treat travelers who had been injured or taken ill during their journeys. A small general store operated by the Kowalski family provided supplies that travelers might need to replace or supplement. The relationship between Margaret Henley and this community was cordial and mutually beneficial. She provided steady customers for the blacksmith and store while offering lodging for Dr. Whitmore during his visits. In return, these businesses helped establish the Widow's Inn as a complete service destination where travelers could address any needs that arose during their journey through Devil's Canyon. The first sign that something might be unusual about Margaret's operation came from Jonas Pittman, the blacksmith. As someone who worked with metal and understood the value of various materials, he noticed that Margaret occasionally asked him to dispose of items that seemed inconsistent with typical inn operations. Broken jewelry, damaged watches, and torn clothing appeared among the refuse she brought to his forge, items that seemed too valuable to discard but too personal to resell through normal channels. When Jonas questioned Margaret about these items, she explained that travelers occasionally left belongings behind, and that unclaimed property eventually needed to be disposed of to prevent the inn from becoming cluttered with abandoned goods. Her explanation was reasonable, but Jonas noticed that the volume of such items seemed disproportionate to the number of guests he observed at the inn. More puzzling was the fact that some of the discarded items showed signs of damage that suggested violence rather than normal wear. Dr. Whitmore also began to notice patterns that seemed unusual for a typical inn operation. During his visits, he occasionally treated travelers who complained of stomach ailments or unexplained drowsiness after meals at the Widow's Inn. The symptoms were generally mild and temporary, easily attributed to the stress of travel or unfamiliar food, but their frequency seemed higher than what he encountered at other establishments. When he mentioned these observations to Margaret, she attributed them to the challenges of cooking with local water and ingredients that might not agree with travelers from different regions. Despite these minor concerns, the Widow's Inn continued to thrive during its first year of operation. Margaret's reputation for hospitality and her daughter's skill in managing guest services created steady customer loyalty among regular travelers. The family appeared to be successfully establishing themselves in their new life, contributing to the local community while building a sustainable business that served an important need along the Devil's Canyon route. The first major change in the inn's operations occurred in March 1872, when Margaret Henley died suddenly during a severe late winter storm. According to her daughter Sarah, who had assumed management of the inn, Margaret had been fighting a respiratory illness for several weeks before her condition worsened rapidly. Dr. Whitmore had been unable to reach the inn due to blocked roads, and by the time the storm cleared, Margaret had succumbed to what Sarah described as pneumonia complicated by exhaustion. Sarah Henley's inheritance of the inn seemed natural and appropriate. At 24, she had been deeply involved in the establishment's operations since its opening, handling much of the cooking and guest service while her mother managed the business aspects. Her younger sister Emma, now 21, continued in her supporting role, managing housekeeping and assisting with food preparation. The transition appeared smooth, with no interruption in service quality or customer satisfaction. However, Jonas Pittman noticed subtle changes in the inn's operations under Sarah's management. The volume of discarded personal items increased significantly, and the nature of these items suggested a different pattern of guest behavior. Instead of the occasional piece of broken jewelry or damaged clothing, he began receiving requests to dispose of intact personal effects. Pocket watches in working condition, gold rings without obvious damage, and clothing that appeared to have been removed rather than worn out. When Jonas questioned Sarah about the increase in abandoned property, her explanations became more elaborate and less convincing. She claimed that travelers were increasingly using the inn as a place to lighten their loads before continuing difficult journeys, leaving behind items they had decided were too heavy or valuable to risk losing on dangerous mountain trails. She also suggested that some guests were deliberately abandoning possessions to avoid creditors or legal complications in their destinations. Dr. Whitmore's visits during Sarah's first months of operation revealed additional changes that concerned him. The frequency of stomach ailments and drowsiness among inn guests increased noticeably, and the symptoms seemed more severe than what he had observed during Margaret's management. Several travelers reported vivid nightmares and memory gaps following their stays at the inn, symptoms that Dr. Whitmore found difficult to attribute to normal travel stress or dietary changes. More troubling was Sarah's reluctance to allow Dr. Whitmore to examine guests who complained of these symptoms. She insisted that the problems were temporary and that medical intervention might alarm other travelers unnecessarily. When he pressed for permission to investigate the symptoms more thoroughly, Sarah suggested that his concerns might be damaging the inn's reputation and affecting her ability to support herself and her sister. The guest registry that Margaret had maintained so carefully became less detailed under Sarah's management. Entries were briefer and less complete, often missing information about guests' destinations or business purposes. When Jonas asked about specific travelers who had been expected to stop at his forge but never appeared, Sarah's explanations were vague and sometimes contradictory. She suggested that travelers often changed their plans without notice, or that they might have found alternative routes that didn't require blacksmith services. Sarah's first winter managing the inn was particularly challenging due to an unusually severe storm season that left Devil's Canyon impassable for extended periods. During these months, the inn was effectively isolated from outside contact, creating conditions where anything might happen without witnesses or intervention. When spring arrived and travel resumed, some regular customers noted changes in the inn's atmosphere that they found difficult to articulate but distinctly uncomfortable. The most significant change was in Emma Henley's demeanor and appearance. Previously cheerful and outgoing, she had become withdrawn and nervous, often appearing startled when addressed directly. Her interactions with guests were brief and mechanical, lacking the warmth and genuine interest that had characterized her service during her mother's management. Several travelers commented that Emma seemed frightened, though of what they couldn't determine. These concerns came to a head in June 1872, when a prominent merchant named Harrison Blake disappeared while traveling the Devil's Canyon route. Blake had been expected to arrive in Denver for important business meetings, and his failure to appear prompted a search effort that traced his movements to the Widow's Inn. According to Sarah's guest registry, Blake had stayed at the inn but left early the following morning to complete his journey. However, searches of the trail between the inn and Denver found no trace of Blake, his horse, or his valuable cargo of silver or samples. The investigation into Blake's disappearance was hampered by the limited law enforcement resources available in the territory and the logistical challenges of conducting a thorough search in the mountainous terrain. Deputy Marshal Robert Crawford questioned Sarah and Emma extensively, but their account of Blake's stay was consistent and seemed credible. Blake had arrived tired and hungry, enjoyed a good meal and comfortable rest, and departed in good spirits the following morning. What the investigation failed to uncover was the growing cache of personal effects hidden in the inn's basement storage area. Blake's distinctive silver pocket watch, engraved with his initials and family crest, was among dozens of valuable items that Sarah had accumulated from guests who had supposedly abandoned them or failed to claim them upon departure. The watch was carefully wrapped and stored alongside gold rings, jewelry, coins, and documents that told the stories of travelers who had trusted the Widow's Inn with their safety. Sarah Henley's death in August 1872 followed the same pattern as her mother's demise. According to Emma, who discovered the body, Sarah had been complaining of severe headaches and fatigue for several days before collapsing suddenly while preparing breakfast for guests. Dr. Whitmore, who examined the body, found no obvious signs of violence or disease, but the rapidity of Sarah's decline suggested either poisoning or a previously undiagnosed medical condition. Emma's inheritance of the inn at age 22 created new concerns among the local community. Unlike her mother and sister, who had demonstrated clear competence in business management, Emma appeared overwhelmed by the responsibilities she had inherited. Her interactions with guests became increasingly erratic, alternating between excessive friendliness and suspicious hostility. The quality of meals declined noticeably, and the inn's physical maintenance began to suffer from neglect. More troubling was Emma's apparent mental state, which seemed to deteriorate rapidly after assuming sole responsibility for the inn's operations. She was observed talking to herself, often carrying on conversations with people who weren't present. Jonas Pittman reported that she had begun bringing him personal effects to dispose of almost daily, claiming that the inn was haunted by the spirits of former guests who wouldn't rest until their possessions were destroyed. Dr. Whitmore's attempts to evaluate Emma's mental condition were frustrated by her refusal to submit to examination and her increasingly paranoid accusations that he was conspiring with others to steal the inn from her. She began barricading herself in the building at night and refusing to serve meals to travelers she didn't recognize, behaviors that were clearly inconsistent with successful in operation but which she defended as necessary security measures. The situation reached a crisis in October 1872, when Emma was found dead in the inn's kitchen by arriving guests who had discovered the front door standing open and no one responding to their calls. The circumstances of her death were more disturbing than those of her predecessors. She had apparently been in the process of preparing a meal when she suddenly began destroying everything within reach, smashing dishes, overturning furniture, and tearing down curtains and decorations. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed that Emma had died from a head injury sustained during her destructive episode, apparently when she struck her head on the iron stove while thrashing about in what appeared to be a violent seizure or psychotic break. The scene suggested that she had been alone when the episode began, ruling out outside intervention but raising questions about what could have triggered such extreme behavior in someone who had seemed merely eccentric rather than violently disturbed. The investigation into Emma's death led to the first systematic search of the Widow's Inn, revealing evidence that transformed the perceived nature of the establishment and its previous operators. Hidden in the basement storage area, investigators discovered a collection of personal effects that represented dozens of travelers who had supposedly left the inn safely but whose possessions suggested a very different fate. The items found in the basement told a story of systematic theft and possible murder that spanned the inn's entire period of operation. Pocket watches, jewelry, coins, and important documents had been carefully cataloged and stored, creating a museum of evidence that contradicted the official accounts of guest departures. Many of the items could be connected to specific individuals who had been reported missing along the Devil's Canyon route, including Harrison Blake's distinctive silver watch. More disturbing was the discovery of a detailed journal kept by Margaret Henley, which documented what appeared to be a systematic process of selecting, drugging, and robbing wealthy travelers who stayed at the inn. The journal entries revealed that Margaret had been using a combination of laudanum and other substances to incapacitate guests, allowing her to steal their possessions and dispose of their bodies in ways that would prevent discovery and investigation. The journal also revealed that Margaret had trained her daughters in these techniques, creating a family enterprise that had operated successfully for over a year before internal conflicts and psychological pressure had led to the breakdown that resulted in the deaths of Sarah and Emma. The precise details of how the victims had been killed and their bodies disposed of remained unclear, but the evidence suggested a level of organization and premeditation that transformed the Widow's Inn from a place of hospitality into a carefully planned criminal operation. The Widow's Inn stood empty for 3 months following Emma Henley's death, its windows boarded shut and a notice posted by territorial authorities warning travelers to seek alternative accommodations. The building's isolation and the disturbing circumstances of the previous operators' deaths made it difficult to find anyone willing to take over the business. The local community had been shaken by the revelation of the Henley family's crimes, and there was serious discussion about demolishing the structure entirely to prevent it from attracting unsavory elements. Into this situation came Victoria Sterling, a widow from St. Louis who arrived in Devil's Canyon in January 1873 with impressive credentials and substantial financial resources. Victoria claimed to have managed several successful hospitality establishments in Missouri before her husband's death in a riverboat accident had left her seeking a fresh start in the West. She carried letters of recommendation from prominent St. Louis businessmen and had enough capital to purchase the inn outright from the territorial authorities, along with funds for extensive renovations and improvements. Victoria's background seemed impeccable. She was an educated woman in her late 30s, well-dressed and articulate, with a kind of refined manners that suggested upper-class origins and extensive experience in business management. Her references described her as an innovative innkeeper who had pioneered new approaches to guest services and facility management, creating establishments that were known throughout the Missouri River region for their exceptional quality and attention to detail. The renovation of the Widows Inn under Victoria's direction was thorough and impressive. She invested heavily in new furnishings, upgraded kitchen equipment, and extensive modifications to the building's layout that improved both efficiency and guest comfort. The common room was enlarged and elegantly decorated. The guest rooms were refurnished with quality furniture and fixtures, and the kitchen was equipped with the latest innovations in food preparation and storage technology. Most notably, Victoria installed a sophisticated system of bells and speaking tubes that allowed communication between different parts of the building, enabling staff to respond quickly to guest needs and coordinate services more effectively. She also constructed additional storage areas in the basement, explaining that proper inventory management was essential for maintaining consistent service quality in such an isolated location. Victoria's approach to staffing was also innovative. Rather than relying solely on family members as the Henleys had done, she hired experienced workers from established hospitality businesses in Denver and Colorado Springs. Her staff included a professional cook named Heinrich Müller, who had worked in high-end hotels in Germany before immigrating to America, and 2 experienced housekeepers who had managed guest services in railroad hotels. The reopening of the Widows Inn in April 1873 was marked by an elaborate celebration that attracted visitors from throughout the territory. Victoria had invited prominent businessmen, territorial officials, and influential community leaders to experience the transformed establishment and spread word about its return to operation. The event was a tremendous success, generating newspaper coverage and testimonials that quickly re-established the inn's reputation as a premier destination for travelers through Devil's Canyon. Victoria's management style was markedly different from that of her predecessors. While the Henleys had operated a simple family-style establishment, Victoria created an atmosphere of elegant sophistication that appealed to wealthy travelers and business leaders who required more luxurious accommodations. Her rates were significantly higher than those charged by the Henleys, but the quality of service justified the increased cost for travelers who could afford premium hospitality. The menu at the renovated Inn featured elaborate dishes prepared with expensive ingredients that Victoria somehow managed to obtain despite the establishment's remote location. Heinrich Müller's European training was evident in the complex sauces and sophisticated preparation techniques that distinguished the inn's cuisine from the simple fare typically available at frontier establishments. Guests regularly praised the quality and variety of the meals, comparing them favorably to the finest restaurants in Denver and San Francisco. Victoria's guest services included amenities that were unprecedented in the region. She provided fresh flowers in each room, high-quality linens that were changed daily, and personal attention to individual preferences and requirements. Her staff maintained detailed records of each guest's likes and dislikes, ensuring that repeat visitors would find their favorite foods available and their rooms prepared exactly to their specifications. The success of Victoria's operation was immediately apparent in the caliber of guests who began frequenting the inn. Wealthy mine owners, prominent merchants, territorial officials, and Eastern investors became regular customers, drawn by the exceptional service and the opportunity to conduct business in comfortable and sophisticated surroundings. The inn's common room became an informal meeting place where important deals were negotiated and territorial politics were discussed. However, Jonas Pittman began to notice troubling patterns in Victoria's operations that reminded him of the concerns he had developed during the Henley family's management. The volume of personal effects that Victoria brought to his forge for disposal was even greater than what he had received from Sarah and Emma, and the items were of notably higher quality, suggesting that wealthier travelers were losing or abandoning more valuable possessions. Victoria's explanations for these discarded items were more sophisticated than those provided by the Henleys. She claimed to operate a formal lost and found service that held unclaimed property for 6 months before disposal, and she produced detailed records that appeared to document her efforts to return items to their owners. However, Jonas noticed that many of the disposal requests came well before the 6-month holding period had expired, and that some items showed signs of damage that seemed inconsistent with normal abandonment. Dr. Whitmore's observations of guests at the renovated inn revealed patterns that were both similar to and different from what he had noticed during the Henley period. The frequency of stomach ailments and unexplained drowsiness remained high, but the symptoms were more subtle and appeared to be targeted at specific types of guests rather than affecting everyone who stayed at the establishment. Wealthy travelers seemed particularly susceptible to these problems, while less affluent guests rarely experienced any difficulties. More concerning was Dr. Whitmore's growing suspicion that some of Victoria's guests were being systematically drugged for purposes beyond simple robbery. Several prominent businessmen reported memory gaps and confusion about business discussions that had taken place during their stays at the inn, suggesting that they might have been incapacitated to prevent them from remembering specific conversations or transactions. These incidents seemed designed to compromise business relationships or extract confidential information rather than simply stealing money and jewelry. The territorial authorities received increasing reports of missing travelers who had last been seen at the Widow's Inn, but investigations were complicated by Victoria's apparent cooperation and the sophisticated nature of her record-keeping systems. Her guest registry was meticulously maintained, with detailed entries documenting arrival and departure times, destinations, and business purposes for each visitor. When questioned about specific missing persons, Victoria could produce apparently credible documentation showing that the individuals had completed their stays and departed safely. However, careful analysis of these records revealed subtle inconsistencies that suggested systematic falsification. Handwriting experts noted that many departure entries appeared to have been made by the same person despite supposedly representing signatures from different guests. Timing analysis showed that some guests had allegedly departed during weather conditions that would have made travel impossible, while others had supposedly left for destinations that investigation revealed they had never reached. The investigation into these discrepancies was complicated by Victoria's political connections and business relationships throughout the territory. Her inn had become an important venue for political meetings and business negotiations, creating a network of influential supporters who had benefited from her services and were reluctant to believe accusations against her. Several territorial officials who had stayed at the inn vouched for Victoria's character and competence, making it difficult to pursue investigations without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The breakthrough in understanding Victoria's operations came from an unexpected source. Heinrich Müller, the professional cook Victoria had hired to manage the inn's kitchen, began to develop concerns about certain aspects of his employer's food preparation practices. As someone with extensive experience in commercial cooking, he recognized that some of the ingredients Victoria provided for special meals were unusual and potentially dangerous when used in the quantities she specified. Heinrich's concerns focused on Victoria's use of various herbs and compounds that she claimed were exotic seasonings obtained from Eastern suppliers. His professional training had taught him to identify potentially harmful substances, and he began to suspect that some of Victoria's seasonings were actually drugs or poisons that could incapacitate or kill people when added to food in sufficient quantities. His attempts to question Victoria about these ingredients were met with evasive answers and threats to terminate his employment. The situation escalated when Heinrich discovered that Victoria had been providing him with false information about the source and nature of certain ingredients. Items she claimed were rare spices imported from Europe were actually pharmaceutical compounds that could be obtained from medical suppliers, while substances she described as traditional cooking ingredients were actually known toxins that had no legitimate culinary applications. This deception convinced Heinrich that Victoria was using her kitchen to systematically poison selected guests. Heinrich's decision to investigate Victoria's activities independently led to discoveries that confirmed his worst suspicions. Hidden in the inn's basement storage areas, he found supplies of various drugs and poisons along with detailed notes about their effects and appropriate dosages for different purposes. Victoria had apparently been conducting systematic experiments in pharmacology, testing different compounds and combinations to achieve specific results ranging from mild incapacitation to death. More disturbing was Heinrich's discovery of detailed profiles of guests that included assessments of their wealth, business connections, and potential value as targets for various criminal schemes. Victoria had been systematically gathering intelligence about her customers, using her position as innkeeper to learn about their financial situations, business plans, and personal vulnerabilities. This information was being used to select victims for different types of exploitation, from simple robbery to more complex fraud schemes. The evidence Heinrich uncovered suggested that Victoria's criminal activities were far more sophisticated and extensive than those of the Henley family. While the Henleys had operated as simple murderers and thieves, Victoria appeared to be running a complex criminal enterprise that included identity theft, business fraud, blackmail, and systematic murder. Her victims were carefully selected based on their potential value, and their exploitation was planned and executed with professional precision. Heinrich's attempts to document Victoria's crimes were discovered when she found him searching her private storage areas in November 1873. The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of Victoria's ruthlessness and her willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened her operations. She attempted to poison Heinrich using one of the same compounds she had been using on guests, but his knowledge of her methods allowed him to recognize and counteract the poison before it could prove fatal. Heinrich's escape from the Widow's Inn and his subsequent testimony to territorial authorities provided the evidence needed to finally take action against Victoria Sterling. His detailed knowledge of her methods, combined with the physical evidence he had discovered and documented, created a compelling case that could not be dismissed or explained away through Victoria's political connections and business relationships. The investigation that followed Heinrich's revelations transformed understanding of the crimes that had been committed at the Widow's Inn. Victoria's operation was revealed to be part of a larger criminal network that had been operating throughout the frontier territories, using hospitality establishments as bases for systematic exploitation of wealthy travelers. Her techniques and methods were far more sophisticated than anything previously encountered in the region, suggesting professional training and extensive experience in criminal enterprises. Victoria Sterling's arrest in December 1873 came after a carefully planned operation by territorial marshals who surrounded the inn and prevented her escape. The evidence seized during the arrest included detailed records of her criminal activities, supplies of various drugs and poisons, and a substantial collection of stolen property representing dozens of victims. The scope and sophistication of her operation shocked even experienced law enforcement officials who had dealt with frontier crime for years. However, Victoria's detention would prove to be temporary. Her criminal network included accomplices who were positioned to arrange her escape, and her knowledge of territorial officials' involvement in corrupt activities provided leverage that she was prepared to use to avoid prosecution. The stage was set for a confrontation between law enforcement and organized crime that would determine whether justice could prevail in the isolated wilderness of Devil's Canyon. Victoria Sterling's death in territorial custody in January 1874 prevented her trial and eliminated the possibility of learning the full extent of her criminal network. According to official reports, she had succumbed to pneumonia complicated by injuries sustained during her arrest. However, the circumstances of her death raised questions about whether she had been killed to prevent her from revealing information about accomplices and collaborators throughout the territorial government and business community. The investigation into Victoria's death was perfunctory and inconclusive, with authorities accepting the official medical explanation despite evidence suggesting that she might have been poisoned using techniques similar to those she had employed against her own victims. The rapid burial and the destruction of evidence from her operation suggested that powerful interests were working to prevent further investigation into her activities and connections. The Widow's Inn was once again left vacant, its reputation further damaged by the revelations about Victoria Sterling's sophisticated criminal enterprise. The building itself had become a symbol of the dangers that could lurk behind facades of respectability and hospitality, making it increasingly difficult to find anyone willing to operate it as a legitimate business. The territorial authorities faced pressure to demolish the structure entirely, but economic considerations and property rights complications prevented immediate action. Local residents and business operators in Devil's Canyon found themselves under suspicion as potential accomplices or collaborators with the criminal enterprises that had operated from the inn. The revelation that Victoria had maintained extensive intelligence files on community members and had apparently been blackmailing some of them created an atmosphere of mistrust and fear that would persist long after her death. The community's social fabric had been damaged by the discovery that their most successful and respected business had been the center of systematic criminal activity. The legacy of Victoria Sterling's operation extended far beyond Devil's Canyon, as territorial authorities began to investigate similar establishments throughout the region for signs of related criminal activity. The techniques and methods she had employed were studied and shared among law enforcement agencies, leading to the exposure of several other criminal enterprises that had been operating under the cover of legitimate hospitality businesses. The Widow's Inn remained empty throughout 1874, its windows boarded and a warning sign posted by territorial authorities. The building had become a local landmark of sorts, but not the kind that attracted visitors. Travelers through Devil's Canyon increasingly made arrangements to camp outdoors rather than seek shelter in the infamous establishment, and the local businesses that had once benefited from inn traffic found themselves struggling financially. The economic impact of the inn's closure was severe for the small community that had developed around it. Jonas Pittman's blacksmith business declined sharply as travelers chose alternative routes that didn't pass through Devil's Canyon, while the Kowalski family's general store faced bankruptcy as their customer base evaporated. Dr. Whitmore reduced his visits to the area, as medical emergencies became rare without the steady stream of travelers who had once frequented the route. Into this economically desperate situation came Rebecca Morrison, a widow from Chicago who arrived in April 1875 with what appeared to be the perfect solution to the community's problems. Rebecca was a businesswoman with extensive experience in hospitality management, having operated successful establishments in Illinois before her husband's death in a railroad accident had left her seeking new opportunities in the West. She carried impressive references and had sufficient capital to purchase the inn and fund its complete renovation. Rebecca's background seemed unimpeachable. She was an attractive woman in her early 40s, well-educated and articulate, with the kind of professional competence that inspired confidence in her ability to restore the inn's reputation and operations. Her references from Chicago described her as an innovative manager who had successfully revitalized struggling hospitality businesses, creating establishments known for exceptional service and customer satisfaction. The renovation of the Widow's Inn under Rebecca's direction was even more extensive than Victoria Sterling's efforts had been. She completely redesigned the interior layout, creating a more efficient flow between different functional areas while maintaining the elegant atmosphere that had characterized Victoria's operation. New furniture, fixtures, and equipment transformed the establishment into what many visitors described as the finest in west of Denver. Rebecca's approach to rebuilding the inn's reputation was systematic and sophisticated. She began by inviting prominent community leaders and business figures to tour the renovated facility, demonstrating the improvements she had made and emphasizing her commitment to legitimate hospitality operations. She commissioned newspaper articles about the inn's transformation and arranged for testimonial letters from satisfied guests to be published in regional publications. The staffing of the renovated inn reflected Rebecca's commitment to professional operations. She hired experienced workers from established businesses throughout the territory, offering competitive wages and benefits that attracted talented individuals who might otherwise have sought employment in Denver or Colorado Springs. Her staff included a master chef trained in French cuisine, experienced housekeepers with backgrounds in luxury hotels, and security personnel who had worked in banking and law enforcement. Most importantly, Rebecca instituted transparent operating procedures designed to address the concerns that had been raised about her predecessors. She maintained detailed public records of all guest arrivals and departures, with multiple staff members required to verify and sign each entry. She established formal lost and found procedures that included newspaper advertisements and extensive efforts to return unclaimed property to its owners. She even arranged for periodic inspections by territorial authorities to confirm that her operations met all legal requirements. The reopening of the Widow's Inn in September 1875 was celebrated throughout the territory as a triumph of legitimate business over criminal exploitation. Rebecca had succeeded in transforming a symbol of corruption and murder into what appeared to be a model of professional hospitality management. The grand reopening celebration attracted visitors from throughout Colorado Territory, generating positive publicity that helped establish Rebecca's reputation as a successful businesswoman. The quality of service at Rebecca's Inn was exceptional, earning praise from even the most discriminating travelers. Her French chef created elaborate menus that featured sophisticated dishes prepared with premium ingredients, while her housekeeping staff maintained standards of cleanliness and comfort that exceeded those found at much larger establishments in major cities. The inn's common areas became gathering places for influential business figures and territorial officials who appreciated the elegant atmosphere and discreet service. Rebecca's success in attracting high-quality clientele was remarkable, considering the inn's troubled history. Within 6 months of reopening, the establishment was hosting some of the most prominent figures in territorial politics and business, including mining executives, railroad officials, and territorial legislators who found the inn's location and facilities ideal for confidential meetings and negotiations. The revenue generated by these high-paying customers quickly established the inn as one of the most profitable hospitality businesses in the region. However, Jonas Pittman began to notice familiar patterns emerging in Rebecca's operations. Despite the transparency measures she had instituted, he was once again receiving requests to dispose of personal effects that seemed too valuable to abandon voluntarily. Rebecca's explanations for these items were convincing and well documented, but the volume and quality of discarded property seemed inconsistent with normal business operations, even accounting for the wealthy clientele she was serving. Dr. Whitmore also observed troubling similarities between Rebecca's operation and those of her predecessors. The frequency of unexplained illnesses among inn guests had returned to the levels he had noticed during Victoria Sterling's management, with symptoms that suggested systematic drugging rather than natural illness. Rebecca's responses to his inquiries were more sophisticated than those of her predecessors, backed by apparent medical knowledge and detailed records, but the patterns remained disturbingly familiar.